Hello and peace to all of you on the other side of the screen. I am Luay Safi, and this is a new lecture of the lecture series Globalization and Monotheism. We are going to focus today on the path of globalization. How did we come to this moment of globalization from the ancient times, particularly from the axial age around 500 to 800 BC, as was suggested by Karl Jaspers, as we saw in the other lecture. We are going to try to, first of all, answer an important question about the nature of this process that led us to a global order. Was this a unilinear process, as suggested by Hegel, moving from the east to the west as humanity progressed? Or is it multilinear? Is there some cyclical elements of it, as many other historians and philosophers of history have suggested since Ibn Khaldun in the 14th century till Spengler and Toynbee in the 20th century. And of course, today, many historians also entertain this notion of globalization or history as a multilinear. So that's one question we'd like to address. The other question is the relationship between culture and civilization. As we saw, there is a bit of confusion for someone like Samuel Huntington. Civilization is nothing other than this broader identity of people who belong to somewhat close cultures. And so we would like really to engage some other philosophers of history and people who address that issue and thought about deeply. Finally, we would like to also today to look at the question of the inevitability of globalization or globalism. Is our current moment temporary? Is it reversible? Can we go from being pushing toward the global society to going back to national society? Or is it part of a larger trend that cannot be reversed easily, as some people think today? So with this, let me then begin by looking at the relationship between trade, commerce, and culture. And I would like to go with you over a few maps, beginning with this map that shows the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. These were two empires that were in competition around, in the 3 centuries before Christ, before the Common Era, through, of course, the 5th century of the Common Era, until the rise of Islam, where there was a major change, as we'll see in the next map. Now, in this map, clearly these are empires that encompass many people with different languages, with different religions. For example, under the Roman Empire, there were a number of communities who have different religious and ethnic background, and there was some level of pluralism then, although the Romans established a social hierarchy where they stood at the top of it and controlled and sometimes enslaved people who were seen as a lesser people, not as important as the Romans. That leads us to, of course, to look at the second phase of the evolution of our global moment, I called here the first globalism for reasons I'm going to point out briefly today, but we're going to spend a longer time contemplating this question of globalism. This is the first globalism for the sheer fact that the influence of the Islamic civilization was worldwide. There was constant communication and lines of travel and commerce throughout the world, or the known world then. Of course, the Americas and the oceanic continents were not discovered yet. And so these were trade routes that we see here in this map. And the dark area, this was the expansion of Islam up until the 2nd century of the Islamic calendar, or the 9th century of the Common Era calendar. That expansion was, of course, the result of another expansion, which was a military expansion, partly military, not all of it. For example, the expansion to the Persian region and the North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, where Spain and the Portugal are located. They came under the Islamic rule, but areas in Central Africa, and particularly in Southeast Asia, this area became Muslim late, around the beginning with the 14th century to the 16th century, where there was a expansion of Islam, and that was done through trade. There was no wars, there were no military armies that were sent there to bring this area under the Islamic umbrella, but these were areas that people chose to convert to Islam because of the influence of culture. And so this is my point. The expansion of trade has always been associated with culture. So it's not clear which begins first, but the relationship is reciprocal. The more trade expands, the more certain culture and cultural exchange take place, and vice versa. The third map is the second globalism. And the reason, of course, we talk about first globalism, not only because there was trade, but there was affinity of cultures. That affinity took place through the cosmopolitan centers around the world, from Egypt, Cairo, to Baghdad in Iraq today, to city like Isfahan in Persia, and Herat, which is in the central Iran today, and in Andalusia, that's the current Spain, where Muslims really for about 7 centuries were part of that place and left great impact, not only on Spain, but really on the entire European, Northwest European region. We'll talk about that in a subsequent lecture. We'll devote more time to understand how that cultural exchange between Andalusia and the Occident, this Northwest Europe, has brought a big, change into Europe. Okay, so this is the first. This is the second globalism. We're talking about modern times, of course, about current times, where again trade is very all over the world. Trade between the Americas and Europe and East Asia and Africa and South Asia. All that trade takes place today. And along with it, cultural affinity. There are some similarities, emerging in terms of how people learn, write. Translation is very active today. People read the work of different authors from different cultures, and that creates really a global culture of sorts. Okay. Again, that modern world of people trading and having cultural affinity cannot be understood apart from the expansion of European colonialism, or European colonial powers colonizing many parts of the world. And here you see that the British colonialism with the red color, which is really huge. That red color was also covered at one point northeast the United States. What's called New England, really, which came under the British rule for a while before the independence. And then you have the French, also this blue color, French colonialism that impacted greatly many societies. The Spaniards also expanded quite a bit, South America, Central America, even North America, California for a while was under Mexico, which also spun out from the Spanish culture. All right, so this is basically the map as we have it today, and of course there was military expansion. Definitely, that was part of it, both within the Islamic and the Western case. But it was not all about power and conquest. Of course, even today, we talk about the soft power of the United States as a culture, a vibrant culture that's able to impact in different ways in terms of science, technology, and entertainment, culture. So not everything, power is part of the expansion, but it's not the whole thing. And this is an important point to be understood. That leads us to again look into the question of is world history progresses in a linear way, or is it in multilinear, where, as we'll see shortly, there is some cyclical element of that progress, and the movement is not as neat as some Western historians try to make it. And particularly we see in the case of Hegel, you see here, this is a definition of not definition, but really this is how Hegel envisaged human progress from the East to the West. So you have this struggle for freedom that started in the Europe, according to Hegel, and that's that quest for freedom happened through struggle and work. Struggle meaning struggle between different powers and work. Marx, who followed closely Hegel, seemed to agree with that, and he has again emphasized struggle and class struggle in the case of Marx, and struggle between the powerful and the less powerful, or the powerless in the case of Hegel. And of course, in both cases, the weaker part of that struggle seems to be able to have the upper hand at the end for reasons that are part of a human psychology and part also of a human society. So that's why we find, like in the case of Hegel, this is a quotation, direct quotation from him in his important work, The Philosophy of History. So he says that the East, until now, knew only one is free. Now, of course, his time, which is in somewhat an exaggeration and a projection, failure to completely comprehend the nature of Asian societies, like Chinese society. So it's a movement from just one person is free, that is to the monarch, into the few that are free, in the case of the Greek and the Roman civilizations, and finally to the all are free in the case of the Germanic world. By that he means the European continent, because after all, that continent was conquered and reshaped by the Germanic tribes. And that's what Hegel, being German as well, proud, I guess, that the Germans were able to reshape Europe the way they did. Okay, so let us look at at another thing that has been ignored by Hegel, and I would like to bring out at this point. Now, the notion that the history has progressed from the East to the West in a very linear way is problematic. I'll use some examples to show that this is not the case, that freedom and the quest for freedom and the realization of freedom in society did not start in Europe. In fact, it started earlier, but it took a very important form under Islamic civilization. And I would like to use a quote from Hegel himself to show that it cannot be the way that he wanted to present in his work. He says here, describing the Islam or Mohammedanism, and in fact in his book he has a lot of positive things to talk about Islam. It's not easy to come up with today by Western philosophers, but in the early 18th century, this is what Hegel has to say about Islam. The leading features of Mohammedanism, which is the Germanic way of saying Islam, involved this, that in actual existence nothing can become fixed, but that everything is destined to expand itself in activity and life. All national caste distinctions vanish. So he's talking about here the spirit of looking at the whole world as made of people who have equal dignity. And that's something that was discussed in the literature and the scholarship and the law under Islamic civilization that lasted about a millennium, from between the 7th and the 17th century. This was the major civilization throughout the world. So it lasted quite a long time. And in that civilization, there was a lot of emphasis on human dignity and the freedom of people to use their own culture, ethnic, and religion under the rule of Islamic dynasties. Again, we'll come back to this point later, but this is one point to show that the unilinear and the assumption that freedom, equal freedom of all people took place in Europe is an exaggeration. Definitely, Europe has pushed the envelope beyond what the Islamic civilization has done in certain areas, but on the other hand, in other areas, it in fact created more controlling situations for many people around the world. So that has also to be addressed, and we'll do that later. But for now, this is something for us to contemplate, to see, was Hegel really, did he ignore certain details to come up with the theory he suggested? Let me look at another piece of evidence from Hegel himself to show that equal dignity and accountability of even political rulers did not start in Europe under modern democracies. This is something that Hegel also addressed in his book to describe what happened under Islamic civilization. Well, and mainly, I mean, this is a long quotation. I thought it's worth looking at, but as you read it, I'm going really to make the following observations: that when he is talking about reconciliation of the secular and the secular power and ethical principles and ethics, this reconciliation he talks about, he said, it started, within the Islamic society, and it took 8 centuries for Europe or Christianity, as he put it, to catch up with that kind of reconciliation. And this reconciliation is nothing other than, using ethics to evaluate political action. In the past, political actions before Islam, political action was rarely evaluated through ethical principles. Some of us are familiar, many of us might be familiar with the work of Saint Augustine, the Catholic bishop and scholar who has written a lot, or saint, in fact, that's why he's called Saint Augustine. He was, pronounced a saint after his passage, after he passed away. And he was really a prolific writer. One of his most important work would be the City of God, maybe either after or before the Confessions. But in the City of God, you could see how St. Augustine struggled. And despite his attempt to look at how to bring, Christian teachings to the world, he seems eventually to believe that only the church can really contain ethical teachings, while the state, or the city of man, as he called it, is full of sin, and the kingdom of God will not be of this world, but of the hereafter. But that was not the case with the Islamic civilization. In Islam, Islamic scholars have really pushed hard to bring political authority under ethical evaluation and under the rule of law, and that was quite an important event in the history of humanity that made it possible for us in our modern society to push even further these two notions. Everyone is under the law. So under Islam, even kings and rulers and religious leaders were not above the law. Everybody was under the law, and even the state has to really abide by certain rules that were established, and legislation, by the way, was done from civil society and was not part of the state structure. So civil society was the locus of legislation, and political powers, political authorities have to abide by the rules of law that was enunciated by non-state scholars who were grounded in civil society. Maybe it's difficult for many of us even to understand what that means, given the fact that always law is attached with the state, but that's something we'll come back to later on in a subsequent talk. Okay, so that lead us to now turn to talk about the Marxian interpretation or understanding of world history. Okay, now before we turn to talk about the cyclical view of history, or what I call the multi-linear view of history, let us conclude the discussion about the unilinear view of history by looking at what Marx has to offer. Of course, Marx really followed closely the view of Hegelian view of history. So to Marx, like Hegel, history is unilinear. It starts from a primitive point, primitive society, through medieval, through modern. And the way he is different from Hegel, obviously, his materialist outlook is at core here. For him, it is not ideas that really the most important locus of historical change, but rather it is power. So with Marx, the emphasis on power in Western philosophy takes a new turn. We'll see that even more pronounced with Nietzsche. But Hegel was the first to put light or shed light on the role of power in society. And this is an important topic, should not be really watered down. So power, important, and the lust for power and the pursuit of power has always been part of what politicians, political leaders, and society generally pursued, because power provide a lot of protection to those who have it, as well as give them more opportunity to advance in the world. For Marx, power was based on a stratification of society. So society was made of classes, and the ruling class always controlled society, controlled the discourse, how people talk about things, how they understand themselves and understand their history. It controlled, most importantly, the means of production. And the struggle in history, from the Marxian point of view, is struggle over the control of the means of production. And that is, there is a lot of truth to it. The problem with Marx is that he really took the opposite side of Hegel. So to him, really, all ideas, values, and literature became a superstructure. It is not the real thing. The real thing is power, while ideas are sort of a mask that are used by those who have the power to disguise their power control and talk in a generalized terms as being part of the entire society. And so the development of history was a result of the struggle among classes. Class struggle is really the motor of history. But then we still see in Marx the same way of looking at history as a unilinear movement from the primitive to the modern. The interesting thing in the Hegelian, in the Marxian thought, is that the end of history, again, this concept of end of history, we find in Hegel, and also we find in Marx. For Hegel, end of history is the coming of the Republican form of government, while for Marx is the coming of the communist society, which is a utopian society, because he has argued that in that society, for each according to his or her abilities, and to each according to their needs. So everything will be plenty, and that would be a peaceful society, because there is no classes there, as if humans become satisfied only if there is no class struggle and there is no variation of income. This is very utopian view of history, because as we saw, for Marx, all talk about even talk about human nature, about sociology, is part of the what he called the superstructure, which was built on the infrastructure. The economy is the infrastructure, which really matters, which is the real thing, and the superstructure was, just as I said, a facade. Of course, I'm trying to reduce the very rich discussions by Marx into this very simple presentation, but really at the bottom, this is the presentation that we get out of Marx, despite the sophistication of his discussions. He has a very deep critique of economics and the economy, but then his solution is so out of this world and so utopian, not even taking human nature into account. That leads me to talk about the other model of historical change, which is the cyclical. And I would like to engage in today two philosophers of history, Oswald Spengler and Arnold Toynbee. These are towering figures in the study of history. And Spengler wrote first his most important work, called The Decline of the West, which he published in 1920. And one would say, well, this is too early for Spengler to talk about the decline of the West. Of course, for Spengler, he was talking about Europe. He did not have, in his view, really a lot beyond Europe. But for him, what was happening in Europe, the cultural degradation within Europe, was as such that it raised alarm. And he published his book, The Decline of the West, in 1914 or 17. And the World War I broke in 1917. And it took about 30 million people. It was very destructive. And it was followed by another world war in 1939, involving also the Occident, countries, Germany, France, Britain, and pulling in also some other countries into the war. But basically, this was inner struggle within Europe. And you could understand why someone like Spengler, a very deep thinker, would talk about decline, because he was seeing what is happening in the mindset of European leaders, and how that could really eventually shake the whole continent, as it really did. And had it not been for the United States, which was not really a country given to the social secularization as was the European continent, the United States was the only Western culture, or not only, but probably the leading Western culture outside of Europe, that refused to have a thorough secularization of society. It continues to uphold those transcendental values that led eventually to having the United States rescuing Europe from its own self-destruction. Let us really look now at what Spengler has to say about civilization and culture. The first thing we encounter in Spengler is his ability to distinguish culture from civilization. So to him, civilization is not culture, but civilization is an advanced stage of culture. So culture grows slowly, develops certain attitudes and values that help it to create a strong economy and strong society, and that strength eventually reveal itself is what we call civilization, where you have an advancement in material, the quality of the material infrastructure of society, technology and education and literature, and of course literature and science start during the cultural phase of the emerging of culture. And so that's what he meant by the distinction between culture and civilization. And as he pointed out, he was really the first in European society to point that out, but not in world society, in world history. The first one to point to the distinction between culture and civilization was Ibn Khaldun, the Andalusian scholar who moved to Tunisia and then Egypt, and written his important work, the Muqaddimah. In his introduction to the history he underscored and identified certain principles that control the evolution of history. One of them is this relationship between what he called the nomadic culture and the sedentary culture. The nomadic culture has certain qualities that made it more suitable to create a new civilization or a new state in his case, but here now Spengler see it as a new civilization. So you have a culture that is more disciplined, more moral, people more courageous in that culture because of the nature of their lives. So their life is simple, is not, they don't live in an extravagant life, they live close to nature. And then at the point when they come to conflict with the sedentary culture, which is the city culture, the advanced culture, where people don't move as much as the nomads, this culture seems not to be able to withstand any serious struggle with the nomadic culture. And so when the sedentary culture become corrupt and fail to organize society in a dignified way, then we have this nomadic culture coming over and controlling society and creating a new state of order. Now, this concept has been taken by Spengler to talk about life cycle of cultures. And the interesting thing is that the beginning of culture is in a simplified way as well, simplistic way. He called the spiritual type that lead to the rise of culture. And so those qualities of being simple, honest, resilient, hardworking, courageous, is what helps a particular culture to grow and become expand beyond its borders, but eventually to come back and lose its momentum as it becomes more sedentary. It establishes its own civilization, and then that leads into a new cycle. So this cyclical understanding of the relationship between culture and civilization, and the fact that Spengler points out to the fact that world history was not made by one culture. If you read from within the European historical world view, you think that Europe was the beginning and the end, that European history evolved around the Greek and the modern society. All good ideas, all sciences, all rational thinking seem to be confined to that space, but this is really a misconception, either the result of ignorance of the depth of the other cultures, or the result of the self-pride or what we'll see in the case of Toynbee, he calls it the egocentric illusion, that all of us really have this great feel of self-worth that we think, not all of us, but that's human tendency, I should say, that people think that they are the most important thing in this world because the world seems to revolve around them. And we find something like that in the writing in many European historians. With these few exceptions, Spengler and Toynbee are not really people who are read a lot these days. They are not really, their ideas are never entertained in any serious way. The most important ideas are those of Hegel and Marx. About the history, I'm talking about history in particular, and there is a lot that is need to be looked into here. So that leads me to talk about Toynbee. Toynbee has identified three important factors for the rise and fall of civilization. These are the universal state, religion, or in the European case, the church, and the third one is the nomadic culture, which is again in the European was this concept of the barbarians. It's a barbarian but heroic age that people can see, and in fact, modern Europe was built somewhat on the Germanic, tribal impact on Europe, including on the United Kingdom or Britain. So the Germanic tribes that found the feudal system on the ruins of the Roman Empire. They invaded Roman Empire at the moment of weakness. This sedentary culture usually in its advanced stage tend to be divisive. People tend to fight each other. People tend to be more relaxed and more complacent. They don't take issues of survival and of cooperation seriously. Don't take the question of collective cooperation seriously. Solidarity weakens during that phase of civilizational progress, and that made them more vulnerable to collapse at a moment of disorder, when they started become more disordered and internal fighting become quite destructive to society. Again, here we find that Toynbee so very clearly, he studied, he identified 19 civilizations throughout the history of humanity. He was influenced definitely by the writing of Spengler, and Khaldun, of course, you refer to him as well as one of the great historians of all times. And we find him that through the study of different civilizations, realized that Western civilization was one of 19 other civilizations. Most of them are extinct. Most of them, I should say, they are distinct. They have vanished, but not vanished completely. But they have been internalized into 5 living cultures. For example, the Islamic culture has within it the culture that was built by the Persian community. It has really a lot of those skills and knowledge were transferred, and they are now they became part of the Islamic culture. And the Islamic culture, being the culture that was spread into all regions that formed the axial age, was able to create a synthesis, bringing elements of the Chinese, the Indian, the Persian, the European, mainly the Greek and Roman cultures, and the Islamic values, the monotheistic worldview, bring them all together into a creative synthesis that has a great impact on Western society and on modern society in indirect way, of course, through the agency of Western civilization. So European civilization, and that was really the point that was hammered time and again, has to be seen as part and not the only thing, as part of both civilizations, and the relationship should not be like either or, but it has to be a unification of all that wood and the civilization together into a new civilization that will be a global civilization. This is the second globalism that I pointed to, and Toynbee wrote really in the middle 20th century, but a lot of what we talk about today was very apparent to him. He could see this rising global society and the role of Europe in bringing that society. But then he said Europe, if it was compared with other civilization, it is only one part. It has to reconcile itself to the rest rather than try to dominate the rest, because it cannot. It will not be able to dominate the rest of humanity, but has to engage it in a positive way. Okay, that leads me to a point. Maybe we should wind down now this talk, but that leads me to an important point raised by Toynbee with regard to European culture, and that is he saw these two elements, war and class, as contributing to the fast decline of Western civilization. Western civilization is almost 2 centuries old. It's not an old civilization. It's a new civilization. The culture that brought it up really started to advance in the 17th century. But moving from advanced culture, vibrant culture, into civilization coincided first with the colonial expansion of Europe, and then with this advancement in science, technology, and literature that is also always a sign of an advanced stage of civilization and growth. Now, this is 200-year civilization is not an old civilization compared with the Islamic civilization that lasted over a millennium, or the Roman Empire, Roman civilization that lasted almost a millennium, and the same thing with the Persian civilization. So it's still, in terms of age, it's not really, doesn't have a long age, but is being shown certain signs of decline, and that he attributed amazingly to two things: war and class. Of course, he was a British citizen, and he saw how Britain eventually, after all that expansion, had to collapse on itself because it invested a lot in war and in domination, wants to dominate, wants to control everybody else. And against class. He was aware of class society because Britain has always been a class society. It improved a lot toward the 20th century, but still there has always been a class society. The United States, on the other hand, almost did away with upper and class that is very dominant and commoners. So you don't have these aristocrats and commoners in the United States for reasons that I don't want to really get into. These are beyond our discussion. But we need to understand that today, a class society is being formed in Northern America. Would that succeed? Well, this is still a big question, and we hope that this will not happen. But it seems that there is a constant move toward a class society where the middle class is being pushed down, it's almost disappearing, and that is quite interesting and painful to see. But at the same time, this speaks to the very argument by Toynbee that class destroys societies, because what class society does, it shrinks the economic base of society. The United States became very prosperous because it looks at economic relationship as a win-win relations, not win-lose relations. But it seems now today there is a more greed and more efforts to try to limit the scope of economic prosperity to a selective few of people. All right, so I would like to end talking about Toynbee, and perhaps end this lecture by looking at this interesting case study that was brought by Toynbee as he tried to show why egocentric society is bad. Why, for example, Eurocentric view of the world is bad. Why always seeing the Europe as larger of the entire globe and entire history is bad. Because it is the result of what he called the egocentric illusion. You know, when you are at the moment, when the power of any particular culture peaks, it looks like, and it's now able to control or artificially control the entire globe, then people think, well, I mean, what we have contributed is only the only thing to behold, the only thing that matters, because all the achievements of those who came before us is nothing in comparison to ours. In fact, probably that would have been a very natural view of from Rome during the Roman Empire. It looks like Rome is greater than anything else, and so for the Romans, it looks like this is the end of history. And this is this is the end of everything. We are the greatest nations and people on earth and in the world. This is egocentric illusion. It's so dangerous. And here is really, I chose part of a letter that was written by the Chinese Emperor Qinlong, who reigned in the 18th century, early 18th century, and whose empire grew quite a bit during his time, even to engulf Central Asia. The Xinjiang region now in China was invaded and controlled during that time. And what happened, George III, who was the same George III against whom the Americans rose up and refused to pay taxes because they were not part of the representation of the British Parliament. The same George III sent a letter to the Emperor of China asking him to allow him to have a commissioner in China to oversee trade between China and Britain. And it looks like the Chinese emperor was so insulted by that request. And this is what he has to write back. He told him, of course, as the tradition, kings send with any emissary certain gifts to the sovereign of the other country, particularly in old time, but even it's been done today as well, in a lesser visible manner. And so he sent some gifts. So what the king saw that these gifts were tributes given to him in acknowledgement of his superiority and his control. And of course, he called his empire the celestial empire. It just looked to him like larger even of the universe. And he said, well, I accept the tribute you sent to me, but don't dream or don't think of having commissioner here, because that person will never be able to understand our great culture. our great culture is so sophisticated, so difficult for someone like him to understand, because after all, I really govern the world, and all kings send tributes to me. And if you read this letter, you think really he was really controlling the whole world. He controlled really exactly the same territory, maybe a bit lesser than current China. So he was sovereign over a small part of the globe then, but to him it felt like he has everything, and he didn't need even trade with Britain. It sounds ironic today because it was the same celestial kingdom of his that came under the control of the British Empire just a century later. And that's what Toynbee called the egocentric illusion. That's so harmful, so self-destructive. And this is for him a good example to show what he meant by that. And therefore he advised his European countrymen, and of course, people of the West, he advised them against this illusion because it's self-destructive, and Europe should stop looking at people outside its boundaries as natives, as he called them, because by calling them natives, you are treating them like a lesser human being, like barbarians, exactly. So the word native is equivalent to the word barbarian that was used by the Roman and the Greek, because when you use that against another human being, then you are going to treat them not appropriately and not as humanly as you treat those who you call like, my equal. And that was his advice. I'm going to conclude with this. And that really brings additional questions for us to look into. And I would like in the next lecture, in the next talk, I would like to focus on the role of monotheism. As you can tell, this series is titled Globalization and Monotheism. Until now, we spoke very little about monotheism. So I would like to devote our next talk completely to understand the role of monotheism in the rise of modern society and in the formation of the path toward globalism. The first globalism, and now we are into the second globalism. So all of that will be part of our discussion in our next lecture, and of course in subsequent lectures. Till then, hope you all do well and stay healthy and safe.